Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review Late Night with the Devil. So, this movie can be easily summed up as a late night show episode that goes horribly awry. We come to find that this movie is to be heavily tied into a time period. 76 to 77, I believe, or it could even be uh, further past that. I'm just kind of drawing upon what uh, the movie is to go on and legitimately tell me. And so we come to this Night Owl late night show, and within this time period, there is either witchcraft going on, or there is to also be a Tonight Show hosted by Johnny Carson that our Night Owl host Jack is to be competing against. We take this journey along this Night Owl late night show to at some point get to find out that Jack has been dealing with hardships, not only with the possible poor ratings of his show, but then his also personal hardships, which they kind of explain fairly early in the movie. We further and further come into this just kind of straightforward movie that eventually curves further and further into the bizarre, having us by the end of the film having to question ourselves whether Jack had either gone on to sell his soul to the devil, had been performing some kind of dark arts or witchcraft to tie into his future success, or sacrificing people for his possible future success, or questioning whether or not Jack is to be alive and or in some kind of state of sorts. And I honestly thought that this movie was just interesting enough. It goes on to remind me of a lot of those kind of Twilight Zone, Outer Limits, Tales of the Crypt kind of horror shows. And really, I think it just focuses a lot on just trying to present this late night talk show that eventually, I don't think that it really gives us enough story in the right places. Yeah, like there are stuff that drops to help us understand more about these characters and how this isn't all just about the money. It's like, no, like I'm going on TV to possibly just help this person out, or I'm coming on here to disprove all of these psychics or supernatural esh like people, and so on and so forth. So really, in a nutshell, like that's what this movie is to all be about. And really, it just kind of quickly comes down to a grading of this show. And really, for me, I cannot quickly jump to give this movie a thumbs up. I would say that this movie really is interesting. Like, it really will more than likely be a movie that, hey, if you have an hour and a half to kill, then this movie may go on and fit that bill. But then also realize that this movie at certain points may be too far bizarre for you to continue watching. There are certain scenes that are to be kind of gross out moments, and maybe this movie may not be for you. But yeah, to me, like, when I was to see the trailer, like, I was just kind of like, okay, like, I didn't feel like this movie was going to be like an overly exciting, overwhelming piece, and so I kind of knew what to expect when I was getting into this, and uh, it really delivers. I feel just a good enough story, and so with that said, yeah, this movie kind of falls in between bad and okay, but more I think on the positive side. And I always would label a movie like this to be just interesting, just kind of more into between of like, hey, if you have an hour and a half to kill, try this movie and see if eventually you're fascinated by these kind of psychic, supernatural, Esh-like characters that eventually get tied into a late night show. So with that said, like, that is really the best I can do to really just say anything about this show, and that really doesn't come off of me really saying much of anything. So I really do apologize, but I have to leave something for the real spoiler part of this review because there is just not enough meat on the bones for me to have like two really separate parts. And with that said, I think it's about that time to just go into spoilers. So yeah, so with that said, I'm gonna pause right here. I'm gonna get my cast list out, and we're gonna go on and just go into full on spoilers. And with that said, let me pause. Okay, spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this film. So in the very beginning of it, we just have this montaging of clips of the time period of either witchcraft like things and Johnny Carson Tonight Show and just some of the stuff that's kind of evently going on. And eventually we get to find out more about Jack Delroy, who is to be this late night talk show host, giving us clips of both Jack and Gus playing around, hitting themselves in the faces with pies, and just having fun with one another, and kind of bringing in these certain guests that may go on and possibly be at the kind of lowest rung of things, especially when we have this kind of this zoologist or this animal woman who ends up bringing a animal in that she ends up losing because like the animal that is supposed to be in this said box thing is not in this box, and they're scrambling around to figure out where it is. Kind of very much like from Ghostbusters 2, like when they have like the world of the psychics, like that kind of thing. It's kind of very much what I could probably easily compare what's going on here too, and that's a very small bit in that film. So we have Jack, who we come to find has a wife, uh, Madeline, who I think he ends up calling Natty or Manny. I think it's Manny, because that's what it said in the subtitles. So Jack, we come to find, has a woman in his life who had come into cancer and is unfortunately going to die. Jack even ends up bringing on his wife onto the show just to really spend as much possible time that he can with her, because seemingly weeks after the time that his wife had come onto the show, she had passed away. So Jack had very much a very dark period of time, especially with his wife passing, but then also like his show consistently tanking, whereas it was almost to be a more combative ratings fight against the Tonight Show's Johnny Carson. So we have Jack, who is to almost walk away from the show because of all of the hardship and stuff that he is just kind of dealing with, as well as certain guests going on and kind of poking at Jack, saying like, "Oh, like what happened to you, Jack? Like you're not as good as you used to be. You're not as good of a host as you used to be." And so Jack kind of takes that as just like, "Yeah, well, maybe I should just get out of here. Like, I'm done," and walks away from it all. So Jack finally, after some time away, comes back to the show and eventually thanks, instead of his sidekick Gus, all of the fans, the audience, etc., for keeping him going instead of having him throw it all away like he almost did X number of uh X number of like a year ago or something along those lines. So Jack is to put on a Halloween special show, and Jack, we come to find out, is to be in desperation to try and make this show as good as it possibly can be because it's Sweeps Week. So Sweeps Week, of course, is like the show where they really have to like put in some real good numbers, or the show may get canceled. So they have to push even more of a good product out. So Jack decides, because it's a Halloween theme, to do something more kind of psychic and supernatural related. So we go on to have Jack's very first host or guest uh, upon this show to, of course, end up being a psychic who is to end up having one name called Christu. So Christu ends up coming out onto the show, and we really have this character who, because I found out from kind of watching a bunch of magic kind of shows and things of that nature, we find out that Christu is going on and looking into the audience and trying to find some connection there. Supposedly psychic connection, but then also we're really just having him even more come off like a fraud, in all honesty, because Christu is doing this thing called cold reading, where we have Christu kind of go out in the audience and he's asking for, at first, a name that starts with a P. He's like, Peterson, Peter, something, Peter, something along those lines. Peterman, Peterson, Peter. Like, he's really reaching out for any letter in the alphabet to have anybody in the audience just jump up and say, "Well, yeah, my so and so family member starts with the name blah, blah, blah," because that's really what happens here. Christu ends up going on and seeking out an audience member with his psychic ability and is asking for a name of Peterman. And this audience member jumps up and like, "Well, yeah, I know a person who's Peterman." And Christu is like, "Oh, well, did they pass away?" And Christu, this audience member, is like, "Well, like it could be something along those lines. Like to me, they could have passed away because they are my ex-wife's name." Uh, and we start to come in on that Christu is like further and further realizing that there is like no way that he can make a connection with this guy, and realizing that this audience member is just making more and more of a joke of Chris2. And so, of course, since Chris2 had failed at this possible reading, he immediately turns to a much more guaranteed result, which is to go on and reach out to this uh to this to these two women who, come to find out, have a family member named Edward who ended up taking his own life. And I think it ends up being a brother to them, and ended up having a teddy bear named Papa. And so we come to find that Chris2 is very successful at all of this, but really even that is to be of false nature. We find out later via the asking of these two women that someone had gone on and asked them a bunch of questions before they had come onto the show. So really this guy is a complete sham. Because all he's doing is just cold reading and really just being not that well at even attempting it, to even really in desperation just going to one family that he knew he could get all the answers right of. So Chris2 then pulls back after the success of this seemingly one ghostly entity, but then all of a sudden we have to question whether or not Chris2 is to really be a legitimate psychic, as Chris2 all of a sudden is to start to cough, and then is to start to roll his eyes in the back of his head. And Chris2 all of a sudden is to really be struggling with his thoughts. And Chris2 all of a sudden is to be in desperation to yell out this name, Manny. And try to figure out within this entire crowd of people who that name connects to. We find out later in the film that the actual name connects to Jack, supposedly. How that is to be some kind of nickname that he was to have gone on and had with his wife. And so Manny is to consistently go on and ask, or Chris2 is to go on and consistently ask for Manny, and how this could be connected to any number of this audience, to have this really just go on deaf ears. And so we really have Jack, who is forced to go on to this commercial break, and we have Chris2, who is consistently now coughing. It seems that he is choking on something of psychic possible nature. And like, it's really just a thing that he's just consistently kind of just coughing up. And the further and further along we go in this movie, eventually he completely vomits up this like tarish, inkish like thing, and that is to be like the first kind of like I guess kind of moment of this film. But to me, I was just like, oh, okay, all right, like we're heading into the bizarre-ish of this. Like, hopefully that's not just it of what we're in store for, but eventually it gets further and further bizarre, more interesting, kind of what they try to accomplish here in this film. But so let's kind of pull back a little bit here. So after, of course, Chris2 is to kind of take this chair, and Jack throws the show onto a commercial break, we consistently have Jack, who is talking to, I want to say that it's his producer or agent of sorts, or maybe even like the director of the show. I'm not quite 100% sure. But he's the guy who is going on to tell Jack, it's like, well, hey, like, you really got to do a really good show to appease this one man who is to be the moneybags of this show. And Jack's only real concern is that they were able to get this woman June onto the show, because June ends up having this girl who is to be Lily. And Lily is to be the real showstopper. And we also realize that Jack is really also concerned about June being here because he is romantically interested in her. And the further and further we go on in this movie, we consistently find out that June is also. Because Lily consistently has to mention that June finds Jack handsome, whatever that really means. But so we have Jack, who is listening to this guy prattle on about how like they really need to put on a good show and this and that. And we would even go on and have, I think, Chris go on and have some malfunctions with the lights with his abilities. And so we have one of the prop guys who are trying to figure out, like, okay, how are we going to fix this lighting problem? So we have Jack, who heads back onto his seat to get ready for the rest of the show. And so we have Jack that turns to Chris and ends up telling him about uh, the next guest of this show, who is to actually be Carmichael Haig, who ends up at first coming off as this very like quick hands magician. And that's where at first assuming that this character just some goofy magician. But instead we find out that Carmichael is to really just be this disprover of the supernatural psychic phenomena of certain human beings. We come to find out that Carmichael is to, via certain little photos and clips and whatever, as soon as he is to go on and arrive upon this show, Carmichael has made his way to Amityville Horror and is to really make scientific experiments upon people to find out the real true problems of any number of these possible possessed individuals or things that can possibly be unexplained beyond a possible just scientific write-off, which it seems that Carmichael is to have written off a $100,000 check to see if anybody can go on and legitimately be a supernatural and or psychic phenomena that Carmichael cannot write off or duplicate within his own means of knowledge and thinking it out and whichever. So Carmichael goes on and he is to start to badmouth some of the characters of the supernatural-esh community, but then eventually he turns around to see that there is Christou still upon this show. And so he immediately starts to say that Christou had gone on to fail numerous times with the one man to then have to turn to this other people and to the audience to have wildly much more success. And so, like, if really Christou was really as good as says he is, like, he would have been able to have numerous successes. But I guess, like, he's just at the poorest rung of the psychic connection of things. And so we go on to have Jack try and help out Christou, and is to mention it's like, well, like Christou had gone on to mention about Manny, and Manny is to have been a nickname of my wife, and we immediately have Carmichael, who's just like, well, like, you could have told him that at any point in time to give him something to boost the ratings of your show. Like, that's all that is. It's just another kind of shenanigan or scam of sorts. And Christou is to be none other than just a snake oil salesman who has stolen who knows how much money from people over the years. So we have Jack kind of up against the wall here, with Carmichael quickly dispelling Christou and writing him off. And Jack is then forced to just be like, well, oh, like, maybe Carmichael can go on and eventually write off a check to our next guest, who ends up being both June and Lily. So we have also Christou, who, before June and Lily even come out, he starts to get very much upset, and he ends up going on to have this vicious coughing fit, which leads him to start spraying this black inkish like thing all over the place, hitting Carmichael, forcing him to then need to trade his blazer in, and Carmichael is spraying seemingly all over the place, having Carmichael just go, oh yeah, that's just another effect or parlor trick of his. And we come back from the commercial break having Jack, of course, after Christou is to have been on the ground needing medical attention. We have Jack, who goes on to tell the audience, is like, well, hey, we will update you on Christou's condition as quick as we are to know it, which he ends up lying to the audience about. Because eventually, Jack ends up getting told by his producer, agent, director fellow that Christou had died on his way to the hospital. That it seems that this was just more than this guy just puking up this black stuff. Like, he just evidently just could not stop, and he died because of it. So, very unexplained journey for that character. So we then get June and Lily coming in, as Jack is to have sneaked away in a commercial break and quickly talked to June about whether or not that she is ready and Lily is ready for this show. And June at first is very unsure, but Jack is to just kind of make her more sure. And so June ends up bringing Lily in, and we seem to have Lily kind of talk in this unusual manner. She is very nice and polite, and is to try to figure out like which camera or which way to just kind of do about this show, because she's like, well, should I just look into the camera, or should I be looking at the host the whole time? Like, what should I be doing? And Jack is to kind of inform her. It's like, oh, no, like, hey, just talk to me, not directly into the camera. And so Lily's like, oh, okay, all right. So Lily goes on to be, of course, happy to be here, and eventually ends up telling us that she is to have something within inside her that is to be kind of wrinkling or wiggling with inside her that ends up going on to take control. More likely, scientifically, we could possibly have written this off as some kind of maybe bizarrish tumor or something along those lines. But so we have Lily that goes on to tell us about this Mr. Wiggler or Wrinkler. And so we eventually have to have a showcasing of this whole ordeal. So Jen goes on and takes one chair, and Lily takes the other. And then eventually we come to find that the thing that is to go on and be inside Lily eventually makes its way out and is to not only sound like Lily, but then is to also sound like this man at the same simultaneous time. And so Lily goes on to kind of give us the thoughts of our characters around us. Going on, and of course, having Lily tell Jack that June finds him very handsome, and then also Lily turning to Jack and realizing that uh, that Lily is very familiar with Jack, that they have had a history together in the past with both Lily and this being, this Wiggler or Wrinkler character. So at some point, we have Lily, the further and further she goes into this character, the more, of course, frightened our audience gets. And we, of course, have us now having really Lily, who's just kind of forcing out of her chair to possibly attack. And we have June, who is trying to pull out her medallion or her amulet of sorts to try to go on and kind of force back this possible demon or possession or thing with inside Lily to have her become normal again. When finally Lily does become normal again, we then have Jack, who is to try and unhook Lily from her tight uh, bands or bond, uh, tying up garment pieces, rope, and whatever, what have you. Leathered straps. Yeah, there we go. So we then have Carmichael, who is to have his own attempt on trying to dispel what is to have gone on with Lily. And Carmichael goes on to really pull aside Gus, who is to be the sidekick here. And we immediately have Gus, who's just like, hey man, like, I want to keep my head, like, perfectly on my shoulders. And Carmichael is like, I'm sure you'll be just fine by the end of this. So Carmichael and Gus sit down upon these two chairs, and Carmichael ends up taking out this watch, leading us to then have Carmichael go into this hypnotic like trance with Gus, and possibly the whole entire audience and possibly some of the viewers at home. And so We then have Carmichael, who starts speaking to Gus, and is to say, it's like, well, hey, Gus, like, you do have a frightening fear of worms now, don't you? And Gus is like, well, yeah, of course I do. And we start to have Gus, who is to start to mention that, man, it is starting to get really hot, seemingly in the studio. So Gus starts to take off a little bit of his clothes, and he continues to sit down, and Carmichael eventually realizes that Gus seems to have a cut upon his neck, and Gus is like, oh, I cut myself shaving earlier. So Gus, the further and further he starts to pick at uh this shaving cut, he all of a sudden starts to pull out this worm. Oh no! And then the further and further that Gus starts to pull out these worms from his neck, he's like, oh my god, like, I think they're everywhere. And so Gus even further starts to pull up his shirt and rip open his chest like it's the easiest thing to do in the world. And all these worms start to fall out of him. Ew, gross, no. I wasn't really all that, like, I was like, okay, all right, this is another bizarrish moment of this film. So we even have Gus, who even has a giant, massive worm coming out of his head and all this jazz, and so Gus falls over. And then Carmichael is to pull the wool over everyone's eyes to just be like, okay, like, awaken, Gus. And Gus is to be perfectly fine. And Jack is to go on and just be like, well, okay, wait a minute. Like, wasn't Gus just full of worms just a minute ago? And Carmichael was like, well, yeah, like, you all have fallen into a hypnotic trance, and you had seen what I had gone on to want you to see. And we have Jack, who makes this astute observation. It's like, well, like, the cameras won't lie to us, so let's, like, cycle this footage and see what we are to see through the clip of that. And so Carmichael is like, good idea, brilliant idea. So Jack goes on to see the exact footage that they were to, of course, just be witness to. And we start to see that Carmichael is much more forcing Gus into this hypnotic state to tell him, like, when he is, of course, getting hot, to, of course, tell him about this cut upon his neck. And, of course, that Gus, when further taking off his clothes, nothing is legitimately there. And so Jack is like, okay, well, right there is the proof that that really, like, there could be some kind of possible sham going on with both June and Lily. But to really prove that there could have been some psychic possible thing going on there, or psychic hypnotic thing going on there, like, let's look back at both June and Lily's footage. So they recycle that footage also, and we further come to find that, like, no, like, there seems to be something completely different going on here. So we have Jack kind of notice some little static in the footage. And so Jack wants to slowly, like, play that back, little clips by clips. And we further find that Jack is to see in the background, holding his shoulder behind him in this footage, that there is to be the ghost of his wife behind him. And Jack is to be just horrified by that footage. So this all of a sudden plays into that one, Lily eventually loses all control. And goes on to have her head split in twine into pieces. And we start to have all the people kind of jump up, and June then goes on into trying to like subdue this beast. And we of course have Lily, who takes this necklace and completely just decapitates uh June and has her be killed. And then Carmichael is going on and spouting out his own kind of ritualish like thing to subdue this monster, and he ends up getting killed also, leaving, of course, Jack desperately trying to just get out of this uh, talk show by just grabbing onto this door, trying to leave. And then so Jack ends up going on to figuring out a way to get out of this set to just end up right back into the set. But then bizarrely, when he reopens this door, he realizes that all that is left is to be an audience that is to be playing out another episode of this show. And so Jack is to really at this point be baffled and confused by the weird hypnotic spinning that is going on, and having both Gus and this old lady possibly hypnotizing Jack into another episode of this show, having Jack desperately pleading to have everyone in the viewing audience turn this show off, leaving Jack to then be thrusted back in a memory of his dying wife, where she is in this bed near close to cancerous death, and Jack is to have to go on and figure out a way to sacrifice his own and or kill his own wife because she can no longer take the pain. So Jack goes on to stab into his own wife, killing her. And I'm like, well, technically, isn't that murder? Technically, isn't that really murder? But also, isn't that also like him sacrificing her in some bizarre way? I don't know. It's just kind of a weird, goofy play out of things. But so Jack is to stab into his own wife. And right after he is to go on and do that, we come to find that Jack is right back into the show of which that he was with Lily and dead June and dead Carmichael. And he is to have put a sword or put a knife, dagger, however you want to slice and dice that, figuratively. He is to have stabbed into Lily. And we have now Jack, who is very much confused at this point, to come to a crossroads of not knowing that all of which that he is witnessing is even real. And so he is desperately thinking, like, dreaming, awake, dead, or whichever, like whatever he keeps going on and muttering. where he's either assuming that he's either dreaming uh, or awake. And I know that there's like a third thing in there somewhere, but I don't remember what it was. So yeah, so like that's where the kind of movie eventually just kind of fades to black, and we're kind of left going like, okay, like that seemed like a very bizarre ending to this film. Um, but yeah, there might have been a scene or two that I probably left out. There might have been some points that I kind of probably left out in the movie or rushed into just to kind of get this one wrapped up. But here's where we are. So with that said, let me know in the comments below how you felt about Late Night with the Devil. Um, whether you were to have gone on and seen this film and just be like, well, yeah, like I liked it, or I thought it was middle of the road, or whatever. So with that said, thank you also for watching this video, and I really do appreciate it. So with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.